We've got mics and everything set up okay, or do we? Anyone else with recorders, or are we good?
Senator, what are your thoughts about the situation in Iraq, ISIS?
Well, certainly our prayers are with the men and women of the military right now dealing with the crisis in Iraq. Sadly, what's happening in Iraq is the latest manifestation of the failures of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy, where for the last 5 years, America has receded from leadership in the world. That has created a vacuum. And into that vacuum have stepped nations like Iran, like Russia, like China. And it's made the world a much more dangerous place. What ISIS is doing in Iraq is unspeakable. ISIS is the face of evil. ISIS right now is crucifying Christians in Iraq. Crucifixion is not something that just occurred 2,000 years ago. They're doing it right now today. ISIS is beheading children who are Christians in Iraq. ISIS consists of radical Islamic terrorists who are so extreme they were thrown out of Al-Qaeda. And that says something. That's not easy to do. And I am glad that President Obama is finally beginning to take the threat of ISIS seriously. Just a few months ago, he dismissed ISIS as the, quote, junior varsity. And the president's foreign policy team utterly missed the threat of ISIS. Indeed, was actively working to arm Syrian rebels who were fighting side by side with ISIS. Now ISIS has taken over much of Iraq. And we're engaged right now in military strikes, but sadly, when the president spoke this morning, he did nothing to articulate a clear military objective that we're trying to accomplish. One of the most consistent failures of the Obama foreign policy is a failure to focus on U.S. national security interests. It seems to me, number one, we need to be protecting Americans and avoiding any scenario that might lead to a hostage scenario reminiscent of what happened in Iran in 1979 and 80. But I think the president's fundamental premise that the solution in Iraq is political reconciliation, I don't think that makes any sense. Look, the Sunnis and Shiites are a sectarian civil war that has been waging for over 1,500 years. They have been battling since 632 AD. And for the President of the United States to think that we can somehow cause Sunnis and Shiites to lay down their arms, embrace arm in arm, and sing Kumbaya is the height of hubris and ignorance. Instead, our focus should be on our U.S. national security interest, on protecting Americans, and it should also be on not partnering with the nation of Iran. One of the most foolish things President Obama has suggested in Iraq is that we should partner with the nation of Iran. Yes, ISIS consists of radical Islamic terrorists who want to kill us. But the enemy of our enemy is not necessarily our friend. And Khomeini and the mullahs in Iran are also radical Islamic terrorists who want to kill us. And we should not use the excuse of the barbarism ISIS is carrying out in Iraq as a way to partner with Iran and to facilitate their acquiring nuclear weapons capability. Because an Iran with nuclear weapons capability is an existential threat both to our friend and ally, the nation of Israel, but also to the United States of America.
So what is the appropriate response to ISIS?
The appropriate response is for the President of the United States to delineate a clearly stated military objective that hinges off of U.S. national security interests. The President has not endeavored to do that. And indeed, if military action is still ongoing, the President needs to come to Congress and seek authorization from Congress for military action. The President has constitutional authority to respond to exigency as Commander-in-Chief. But Congress has the authority to declare war. And part of the reason the Constitution has that check and balance on the President is it forces the President to explain what he's trying to accomplish. And to explain it, I would hope that you would see members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, pressing the administration. What is the military objective we are trying to accomplish, and how are we trying to accomplish? rather than doing an airstrike here and a missile drop there that is not directed to accomplishing quantifiable military objectives that further our national security interests.
Senator, are you saying the AUMF isn't enough of justification for the administration to do this in Iraq? And also, you mentioned the Obama-Clinton failures, but what does the current situation in Iraq say about the decision to go in the first place in 2003?
I believe initiating new military hostilities in a sustained basis in Iraq obligates the President to go back to Congress and to make the case to seek congressional authorization. I hope if he intends to continue this that he does that. And part of the process, look, not only does the President have to justify to Congress, the President has to justify to the American people, what are we trying to accomplish? He hasn't done that. Part of the reason why Congress did not agree with the President's proposed military attacks in Syria is because the President was never able to articulate a clear national security interest that he wanted to carry out in a defined objective. We should do so with ISIS. There may well be a serious national security case to be made that taking out the ability of ISIS to wage war furthers our national security interest. For example, ISIS is right now fighting with U.S. weaponry, fighting with Abrams tanks from America that they seized. And it may well be in our national security interest to take out their capacity to wage war. But the President hasn't articulated that. He needs to do that. He owes that both to the elected representatives and to the American people.
Senator Cruz, do you support sending U.S. ground forces back into Iraq, and do you believe that the President was wrong for not getting the status of forces agreement in 2011 and pulling U.S. troops out then?
There is no doubt that the withdrawal from Iraq in 2011 was driven by political considerations rather than focusing on national security interest. Indeed, it was striking in Secretary Gates' book that he said as much, that it was all about politics instead of defending the national security of this country. That is an abdication of responsibility for the Commander-in-Chief. And on the question of ground forces, that question can't be answered in the hypothetical without a clearly defined mission that is directed towards protecting U.S. national security interests. There may be instances, for example, to rescue Americans who may be in harm's way where a limited use of ground forces is necessary, and the President might lay out a case for that, but he hadn't done it yet. And it is the Commander-in-Chief's imperative to do so, and I hope he will stand up and do so.
Senator, when it comes to congressional authorization, one of the controversial methods for doing this is the War Powers Act. Do you think that's constitutional?
You know, that has been an issue debated for a long time. What I can say is Congress has the authority to declare war, and too many presidents in both parties have abused their authority ostensibly under the War Powers Act. It is incumbent on the President to come to Congress. The Syrian example is a very good example. When the President initially said that he intended to launch unilateral military attacks against Syria, I initially kept an open mind. I said, listen, I want to listen to the President, I want to listen to the administration, and I want to hear their arguments as to how this furthers our U.S. national security interest, what the stated objective is, and how we intend to carry it out. And in the course of both public hearings and classified hearings, when I asked those questions, the administration was unable to provide a satisfactory answer. Indeed, it entered the theater of the absurd with Syria when John Kerry said their intention was to launch a, quote, unbelievably small attack, at which point it was very difficult to see how that was furthering our interest. In this case, the President has a constitutional obligation to recognize the authority of Congress to wage war and to declare war. And if this is going to be more than emergency action to deal with exigent circumstances, then the President should go to Congress.
Since we haven't declared war since 1942, how do we move back to that when it's become?
Well, an authorization for use of military force is a form of a declaration of war. It is recognizing the authority of Congress, and that is an appropriate avenue for Congress to exercise that power.
And pay for it. There's a lot of people who think the debt is going up. A lot of it has to do with our never-ending military endeavors.
It is a very good question, and you can't answer that until you know what the it is. The question of how do you pay for it depends upon what is the it the President is proposing doing. And history has taught us that America gets in trouble in military engagements when we get involved on the whims of politicians. Without a clearly defined objective, we send our sons and daughters into harm's way, and you never can tell when the objective is accomplished because there's no objective set out in the first place. If there's a clearly defined objective, then you can assess what's the cost, and is the benefit for our national security interests sufficient to justify that cost. The President has not even attempted to make that case yet.
Senator, the New York Times reported that President Obama and the Obama administration was trying to avoid another repeat of Benghazi in Iraq, which was part of the reason why he sent air support. Do you think that's a strong enough case?
It could very well be. Listen, the President has an obligation to protect Americans. There are thousands of Americans, both civilian and military, in Iraq. If their lives are in serious jeopardy, the President should do everything necessary to protect them. I'm very concerned as to why we have so many Americans there. Why we would allow Americans to potentially be trapped right in the middle of a sectarian civil war between Sunnis and Shiites. You know, I asked to the Senate Armed Services Committee, a senior military leader, the simple question, are we dependent on Shia militia for the safety of our embassy? The answer was yes. That is a highly concerning situation, given that the Shia are basically operating as a puppet government for Iran. And it is quite like the situation in Ukraine before the invasion, where the prior government of Ukraine functioned as a puppet government for Putin. I think there is a similar situation playing out in Iraq vis-a-vis Iran. And in both instances, it is a mistake for us to trust the safety and security of Americans to those who have repeatedly made clear their hostile intentions to the United States.
Last time for one question. Yeah.
After dealing with the humanitarian crisis on the border with your bill, and if the House is able to get through with theirs, do you have any plans to deal with dreamers down the road once the border is secure?
You know, my focus with the humanitarian crisis was to address the cause of this crisis. In the past several weeks, I've been to the border. I've met with the Chief of the Border Patrol in McAllen. I've met with line agents in the Border Patrol. I've been to Lackland Air Force Base, where there's some 1,200 children being met. I would note President Obama has done neither of those. He's been unwilling to go to the border, unwilling to go to Lackland, to the Air Force bases where these children are being held. And my focus has been, how do we solve this crisis here and now? 3 years ago, in 2011, there were roughly 6,000 unaccompanied children apprehended crossing into this country. Then in 2012, the President unilaterally granted amnesty to some 800,000 people who'd entered the country illegally as children. And the direct consequence, the foreseeable consequence of that, of granting amnesty to people who entered as children, is that it created an enormous incentive for more and more children to enter, and we've seen the number of kids skyrocket. We are seeing a humanitarian crisis, and the crisis is the direct result of the President's own lawlessness. The Border Patrol interviewed over 200 people who had recently entered illegally. And they asked those people who had entered, many of them children, why are you coming? What's changed? 95% of them said they are coming because they believe they will get amnesty. They believe they will get a permiso. You will not solve the crisis at the border, the humanitarian crisis, unless and until you end the promise of amnesty. So the legislation I filed was prospective only. It was not retrospective. It did not address the dreamers that were addressed in the initial DACA. Instead, it simply codified that the President has no authority prospectively to grant amnesty to anyone who's entered this country illegally. Now, why was it prospective? Because that's the cause of the crisis. The cause of the crisis is the kids who are coming illegally believe they too will get amnesty. And so if you're going to solve the crisis, you have to focus on what's causing it. And I would note that the House of Representatives stood up and led. They passed serious legislation to stop the promise of amnesty from President Obama that is causing this crisis, to stop tens of thousands of kids from being trafficked by violent drug cartels who are abusing these kids. And the House stood up and led, and Harry Reid and the Senate Democrats blocked any vote on meaningful reform. And then Harry Reid sent the Senate home for August with doing nothing to address this crisis. That is not humane. It is not compassionate. Allowing tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of kids to continue to be brought in, little boys and little girls, physically assaulted, sexually assaulted, is cold-hearted and callous. You know, when I was at Lackland Air Force Base, one of the senior officials there described to me how these drug cartels that are smuggling these children in will sometimes hold the kids captive and try to extort additional ransom from the families if they ever want to see the children again. And if the parents don't send in money, they will cut off and send back body parts. And they described how these coyotes will put a gun to the back of the head of a little boy or little girl and force that child to cut off the fingers or ears of another little boy or little girl. If they don't, they'll shoot the kid. And so we're dealing with some children who have been horribly maimed and disfigured, and other children who have enormous psychological trauma from being forced on pain of death to carry out such horrific acts. Listen, I am the son of a refugee who came from Cuba seeking freedom. I understand the plight of these kids. And there is nothing humane about President Obama's approach and Harry Reid's approach, which is to do nothing, zero, absolutely nada, to solve the problem. You will not solve the problem. You will not prevent this humanitarian crisis unless and until you end the promise of amnesty. And I would note, the Obama administration, many of its senior officials go on TV and they say, these children are not eligible for DACA. They're not eligible for amnesty. Well, if that's the case, then the Obama administration should support the legislation I introduced that the House passed. Because if these children are not eligible for amnesty, then let's put it in the law. And the reason they don't want to, the reason the kids are coming, not because they think they are eligible for the previous DACA, it's because they believe President Obama is going to grant more amnesty. And just a few months ago, President Obama asked his Secretary of Homeland Security, prepare a plan to grant amnesty to 5 or 6 million more people. He has no legal authority to do that, no constitutional authority to do that. And the only way we will stop this humanitarian crisis is to end President Obama's amnesty. Thank you very much.